Good afternoon, folks. We are live and up and running once again. Let me get everything switched over to the right layout. We will do a quick sound check and then jump into today's Beatbox jam stream. All right, we should have video and audio. The EQ might be a little high. See, we'll leave the volume about there, and then people can let me know if they're having trouble hearing me. It's been a while since we've done one of these. I think it's been at least a couple months. I have to kind of recalibrate everything since I have not been doing streaming with my loop, but hopefully everything is audible and not coming in with a lot of distortion. So let me put on a real quick loop that I did while we were starting up, and we'll talk about what's on the agenda for today. Well, in keeping with the ongoing theme of talking about technique and practice drills and all that, in addition to our regular BGM brainstorming, we're going to do kind of a return to the basics overview today, because it's been a little bit. We'll go through what I kind of been putting together as far as some continued basic training for all of the core beatbox sounds. Kind of a build on our last couple conversations about basics. Some kind of tips for what I think helps people at the beginning, intermediate, and even advanced level when it comes to the core instruments and sound sets for the Beatbox toolkit. We'll go through and take some of those ideas and apply them to drills and practice. And depending on how long that takes after that, we'll spend the duration of the stream working on BGM brainstorming for future projects. But before we do that, we need to warm up the blood circulating to the face muscles and sections of the sound creation anatomy. And this will be a good opportunity for me to keep an eye on the sound and tweak things on the fly if necessary. What we'll do is we will clear the loop off, We'll save this file so that we can jump straight into it when we get to the BGM section of the stream. And we will kick things off with some warm-up slash freestyle practice. And I'll be keeping an eye on the audio readout and the levels for playback. I think that since the last time I did this, I swapped around my sound sources a little, which may or may not affect how I have to calibrate all of my in-loop settings, which is a little bit annoying, but it is what it is. So let's jump into some warm-up. Let's see how long we can string together some freestyle stuff, and we'll go on from there. All right. Let me swap the caption. And we'll move on to technique and sound theory discussion. I think audio levels are about where they need to be for the more blunt sounding synth snares. I need to not point directly at my mic or I'll redline it. Same thing with my BGM. Everything else seems to be all right. So I'm going to leave the audio settings where they are for the moment, and I can always tweak them on the fly if I need to. So as the stream title would suggest, every once in a while when we do these jam streams, and I will try and make an effort to do these more frequently, every couple months is kind of a long gap in between, just because my stream schedule's been a little bit erratic and unpredictable lately. I will try and make an effort to do these at least once a month, every few weeks, unless people want me to do them more frequently. That way we can keep the discussion going and also use the time to brainstorm more ideas for future BGM releases. Because so far in 2026, the release calendar has been pretty much non-existent. Did I release anything this year? I don't think I have yet. The biggest project is not done yet, but there should be a surprise release this week for something small. I will refrain from talking about it for now because it's not going to get its own dedicated stream, but I will be posting on the community Discord and places like Twitter and Blue Sky when it goes live because it's a kind of unique project. My first ever collab music project is what's being released. And it wasn't originally part of my calendar, but the opportunity kind of fell into my lap. So that will be coming out. And hopefully the cover will be out. Ooh, if I can do it in June, that would be great. But we shall see. I'm in the process of editing, and I think I need to re-record it. But there is stuff coming. Again, 2026 is probably not going to be the most robust year for releases, but that's okay, because I've been really trying to put a lot of effort into the stuff that I am working on instead of just churning out music projects for the sake of releasing stuff. So that'll be coming soon, and I'll be talking about it more in our community spots. So for the whole idea of basics, again, I won't rehash just the core concepts of creating the instrument sounds for the Beatbox toolkit. We've done that a lot, and if you want to refer back to the older stream archives for things like the basics overview or brush ups that I've done, that would get into more of the nuts and bolts of how you create the different sounds. What I want to work on today is kind of like an intermediate to advanced drill overview for practicing the sounds once someone who's getting into beatboxing knows how to control and create the sounds effectively. So a person who's beyond just learning the techniques of things and is trying to practice and sharpen up with the actual sounds, that's what I'm going to kind of gear the discussion for the practice and sound theory for today. And we'll start with the first core sound of the Beatbox toolkit, what I consider one of the three essentials, which I think is pretty universal terminology, the kick. So the kick drum is what usually defines not only the kind of pacing of the song as it goes into the rhythm, but also kind of the force and kind of flavor of the track that you're putting together when it comes to creating patterns, creating more fleshed out, longer pattern chains, which then become routines. And that becomes the whole kind of skeleton of your song and all the other instrumentation that you might be putting in your basses, your synths, your other types of sounds and sound effects. Really kind of revolve around the core rhythms if you're kind of constructing things from the ground up. At least for me, I have done things kind of backwards where I will establish like maybe melodies or bass lines or things first and then kind of construct the rhythm. But very rarely will I go into that having no idea of what rhythm, pacing, BPM I want for whatever sound or song I'm going to create. And so we know that at its most simple level, quarter notes for a bass drum kick. You know, your 1, 2, 3, 4, like a 4 on the floor rhythm, just a We've talked about that before as far as when you're first getting into beatboxing, first kind of learning control and consistency with just getting the sound to come out correctly. That's all pretty rudimentary and something most people will learn within their first day or so of getting into beatboxing. Where it starts to get tricky, and where I think a lot of people kind of collectively agree that it not really is a wall skill wise, but when it comes to adapting just the kick drum sound to something that's more than just a 1, 2, 3, 4, like a 4 count quarter notes, is one, increasing the speed and the frequency of the kicks in different patterns. And from there, you build into things like double, triple kicks, or even quadruple kicks, which I don't even know if I can do a quadruple kick. But instead of just a single bass pedal, you start getting into the more advanced, higher speed rhythms, higher intensity things that would be like a double bass pedal, something you might see in a metal type of rhythm, or like a real high speed electronic rhythm, or even a slower rhythm that just has a more busy rhythm to it. And so I've been tinkering around with kind of more irregular rhythms for just the kicks. Okay, we're just doing the kick sound, the kick drum on its own, and playing around with the drills of doing it over and over and over again to get the muscle memory and the consistency with not just doing this 4 on the floor, simple 4 count, because as you kind of flesh out your style and the types of songs you want to create, you want to give yourself as many tools as possible to create as much variation and kind of unique flavor to the beats that you're creating, which goes without saying. That's nothing groundbreaking. But I did it in the warm-up just to kind of remind myself that I wanted to use this example. But taking that kick rhythm and making it kind of more bouncy is the best way I can kind of explain it. I'd have to think really hard because I'm bad at summarizing counting time in musical notation because I'm not a classically trained musician. But if we just think about the contrast between a 1, 2, 3, 4 rhythm like I did before, and what I consider a more bouncy rhythm that's almost going more back and forth, something you'd probably see in a more high speed, like electronic EDM style, but instead of just the rhythm I was doing in warm up was something that sounds more like it's more staggered with off beats. It's not quite a gallop, but to me, it kind of sounds like the beats kind of bouncing back and forth, and it has a little bit more of an irregular tempo than just 1, 2, 3, 4 straight count and quarter notes. And if you slow it down a bit more as a practice drill, it would be 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. Okay. And it's repeated over and over until it stops and then adds in another count, then loops back again. So again, it's like a slow double kick almost. If you slow it down even more as a way to just learn the difference in the rhythm, if you're just trying to test this pattern out in a drill, even slower than what I just did, you would do something like it's a little bit difficult for me to kind of train my brain backwards because I'm used to doing that rhythm so much faster. But in starting out with just the slow version of like a single double kicks, but not like a double bass kick, which we'll talk about in a sec. And just starting with the rhythm and getting that kind of bouncy tempo and becoming familiar with not just, again, the single quarter note kick drum hits on each section of each measure for the rhythm itself. I think that's a pretty good way to train because, again, it's probably going to be unfamiliar at first. And then as you get comfortable with doing it real slow, then you start to ramp it up, increasing the speed of that simple rhythm and then pushing kind of limits of how fast you can do that rhythm in drill just over and over and over again until it becomes hard to maintain. And that's kind of like your speed ceiling. So if we think about going at the speed I was doing it before, And if we were to ratchet the speed up on it even more, and all of a sudden it's probably becoming more, maybe almost more like a faster metal rhythm that you would use, you would get something that has everything more kind of crammed and condensed together, if that makes sense. And it would be, and then from there you would add things like mixing in hats and snares somewhere to create a more fleshed out rhythm that you would do as part of the drill. If you wanted to, you could just practice with the kicks. But I think eventually, when you get comfortable enough adjusting the speed and the rhythm of that particular sequence of beats notes, you'd want to figure out what are you going to do with it now that you can do that kind of more complicated multi-kick line. So if I was going to just throw in hats and maybe a PF snare, I think that's more or less recreating the same bass drum line. I have to adjust it slightly because my lips are making other sounds at the same time and not just the kicks, so it's now becoming layered in a way. But more or less, and I don't know what I would use a rhythm like that for. It's kind of fast. Maybe it's a couple beats and a time signature switch away from doing like the real standard 3/4 example I've used a few times at a slower pace, but with more notes kind of together. That was the it's not identical, but that's what it reminds me to me. If you just make it a 3/4 count instead of like a fast 4, and then it just becomes the Summoning by Sleep Token, which is my kind of blueprint for that particular rhythm because it's the one that sticks out in my brain whenever I try and think of a non-waltz 3/4 count that in that particular example doesn't stay in 3/4. It changes a couple times. But I think taking the idea of the bass drum, and before you start getting into the realm of double or triple kicks with like a BTB or BT, just being able to do like a single and rapid singles in a row is a good way to start. That way you're not just locked into doing the BTB for like a double or triple. And what I mean by that is being able to go instead of, well, that's triple. So maybe that's all with just single fast notes together instead of is the BTB, which functions like a triple double bass pedal kick, but you have more than one way to do it because you can go, that's singles 3 at once, or you can even string them together. And I don't know if anyone really focuses on the difference because depending on how people choose to practice, it might just be easier to get familiar with using the BTB as your triplet pattern. But I think it's kind of a neat variation to try and duplicate some of the fast multi-pedal kicks using just singles quickly, but you have to kind of practice for that. If you're in the habit of only doing slow single kicks, you're and the is the fastest you're really familiar or comfortable doing a multiple rhythm kick drum, then it's going to be harder to adapt that to something faster versus if you used a BTB. The slots in a little bit differently because it's faster, but same concept. Instead of just 1 2 3, it's 1 2 3 with the BTB sound that's creating the same kind of audio effect. I think they're close, but they don't sound identical just because I've practiced both. But like we've talked about on previous streams with drilling basics for things like the bass drum kit or kick drum, it starts with the quarter notes, the then the next step up, which is a little bit harder, would be eighth notes. And then once that becomes really easy and familiar, 16th notes be more rapid. That's a really good point to try and shoot for when you're practicing early on, having just learned the sounds, because I could not do kicks that fast when I first started out. And I kind of wish I sat down for at least the first few weeks and practiced just doing things like the kick sound. We'll get to hats and snares in the discussion in a little bit, but just being able to do the consistently, and I'm still trying to get better at the consistency and cleanliness of that sound. And maybe if I keep pushing it, I can get up to 30-second notes, but I can't do 30-second note kicks. That's incredibly fast. But triplet single kicks instead of the BTB is also a good way to practice when it comes to that speed and learning how to get the muscle memory to the point where you don't really have to think about speed. You just can slot in the rhythm, the overall section of the percussion line. So if we think about triplet kicks, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, instead of slowing the BTB down that much to make the triplet sound makes them sound more like a single plus a hat plus a single. But if you make it faster, same thing, two different examples of a triplet pattern, two different ways. So you have options. You have a variety and a way to sort of think what fits the most for the particular type of rhythm or pattern that you want to create and how it fits the theme of the song. Logically, if you keep experimenting around with the speed and how you're getting the rapid fire kick sounds to come out, that's when you start mixing and matching singles to doubles to triples or anything like that to create more complex. I don't know if it really be considered like a polyrhythm. It's a kind of more advanced drum concept. But if you think of the kick line going from just a to a mix of the singles, doubles, and etc. to make it more complicated to the ear, you might get something like maybe add like a breakdown in the middle so that it changes and then goes back to the original kind of time signature. You might get kind of like a transitional section, changes the rhythm up, maybe speeds it up, then goes back to the original. At that point, you're getting into a really complex type of rhythm, and if you're not careful, all of the effort's going to go into just the kicks because you would have to think, all right, what other instrument types am I going to add to just the rhythm? And then obviously after that, how am I going to layer in bass, synths, and everything else? So you wouldn't want to go completely ham on just the kicks, but in that particular example, if you wanted to make it that complex, you definitely could. Moving on to hats. Hats are a little bit more straightforward, I think, because your hats are going to primarily complement your kick line and your snares. And I guess it's possible you can have a hat-driven rhythm where that's dictating everything else, but I find that hats are more complementary, at least the way I work on rhythms. That doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, though. But if you think of closed hats, the T sound, just learn early on, and this is something, again, I didn't really focus on in the beginning, which I had. Learning how to apply the same speed principles that we just talked about with kicks to hats will give you a lot more options for stringing together hi-hat runs or hat rhythms that are going to bounce off of the other components of your drum kit pretty well. And I've been working on it a bit. I still don't prioritize it, which is something that I need to remind myself to do. But starting off with just the quarter notes, again, same idea. eighth notes, 16th notes, where it starts to get harder. It gets harder to keep it really sharp without it starting to become more breathy and airy. Because hats are much lighter and I think by default potentially faster type of sound because of how much air you're using, I like the idea of mixing open and closed hats for things like hat runs instead of just, I'm going to do triplet closed hat runs, which you can do, versus closed open in similar types of variations and rhythms, or something like, or like we've done as the basic example of open to closed hats in just a similar simple loop, the snake jazz from Rick and Morty. It's a jazz rhythm. Or making it more like a brush. You're going to be able to do a lot more that changes and kind of tweaks the sound of hats because they can be influenced by things like mouth position, lip openings or closings, and everything else. And I think it's kind of important to not just focus on speed, but irregularity in your rhythms for hats, just to, again, program your brain to jump between all of the non-standard rhythms, so you're not just always doing like a 4-count simple quarter note hat string. And in the beginning it'll be simple, and as you're learning it'll be kind of rudimentary when you're trying to figure out how to slot in the hats with everything else. But as you start getting into things later and adding in more complexity, having a command of being able to do the hats at different speeds and whatnot will only make that easier when you're trying to do those more advanced rhythms. So a good example might be, in the beginning, you're starting with just it's like a rock rhythm. That's hats on the offbeat. Next level of complexity up in that exact same rhythm example might be a double hat. Again, pretty simple. Seems like it'd be really straightforward. But if you add another layer onto that and make the hat line constant, I don't know what that rhythm is called, but you hear it in a lot of media where the hat doesn't stop. It's constant while the bass and the snare are going. You would get something like, I can't help but actually mimic what the drums are doing with my hands. You can't see it because I'm not on camera, but for some reason, whenever I do beatboxing stuff, my hands need to do something, which is very common. But that constant hat line, with just the sounds really simple, but when it's paired with the kick and the snare and it's all layered, I'm not able to do the hat constantly because I have to do the snare with my mouth as well. But it's so constant you don't really notice because of everything that's layered together. Because it would essentially be sounding like without the snare, because there's a gap where the snare is. But when it's all layered together at once and it's seamless, you can't really tell unless you just listen really carefully. But that's where the if I was recording this with a loop station or something like that, obviously the track would be unbroken. Each layer would be constant. But when you're making all of the sounds just using your mouth, kind of a way to create the auditory illusion that there is unbroken tracks all being played at the same time is where that layering comes from, which is kind of a neat thing that's unique to beatboxing, I think. But yeah, consistency and rhythm training with hats. I don't spend enough time doing that. So I've been trying to just slot in some time of just doing the drills with simple and then more advanced or irregular rhythms with the hats, and then experimenting with the open or closed sounds so that it's changing between each section of the rhythm. Now, probably the third component and the most complicated, in my opinion, when it comes to just doing basic drills, and that's the snare. Depending on the snare you're using for your rhythm or your pattern, probably determines one, your options on how to slot it into the overall percussion line, but also kind of your limitations when it comes to experimenting or fleshing out what you can do with the snare. And the best examples I can think of would be to construct all the other components of the rhythm first with hats, kicks, hats, and then plug in the snare as the third one, because you could do it in reverse, but saying I want snares on the ones to me is kind of backwards in thinking, and it doesn't intuitively occur to me, versus having the kick line establishing sort of the main rhythm, then the hats, and then putting the snare where I want just seems more intuitive to me. I don't know, because I'm not a trained percussionist, if that's normally the way drummers think. Maybe they can visualize all at once and then allocate sounds to where they need to be time-wise. I don't know. I'd have to ask a drummer. But if we were to use the PF snare as the simplest example, and maybe try it with a couple others. If we take our original example, say that rock rhythm. I think the training exercise here, assuming you weren't just doing straight up drills with only the snare itself, which I also think is important, on the quarter notes for the PF, and then from there, eighth notes, and so on. That's good for consistency and speed training. But as far as kind of adapting to a rhythm, I think it's easier to slot it in and then play around with where you're putting the snare itself. So in this case, it would be on the third beat, roughly. It's not on the off beat. That would be, yeah. Hats on the immediate off beat, and then the snares after it. But if we were taking that example, and we think about, all right, how do we want to move the snare around to change what the rhythm sounds like? And this is kind of a challenging way to force your brain to reorganize the overall construction of your rhythms. I'm not good at this, so I'm trying to do it more as part of the training. But if we think about moving the snare onto the one, what would that sound like? Ooh, that actually feels really weird, because the snare is taking the place of the kick. If it loops, it kind of becomes the same rhythm again. So maybe if we tried to put it, that actually kind of hurts my brain a little bit to think about. So maybe instead, to keep it simple for the sake of talking about drills and not making it too complicated, if we add more snares to where the current positioning is, so maybe we would have something like, okay, so we start like 3 or 4 bars of just the regular rhythm, then I'll do like 3 or 4 bars with the added one. We'll kind of compare. So starting with the regular one, I had to make it alternate to make it fit a little more naturally, just to me. But adding in the snares, or even changing the rhythm, which we won't get into something that complicated here. But taking that idea and applying it to all the different types of snares, I think would be really good basic training for, I think, anybody at any level. Even going from one snare to another, which would also be difficult because you're having to jump mouth positions. Let's say we went from the PF snare to the outwards K in that exact same example. So if we went that sounds weird, and I don't think I'd do that in a song because it sounds a little bit jarring. But for the sake of practice, going from the those are two pretty different mouth positions when it comes to generating the snare sound itself. The PF, just a P plus F sound, is all lips, really, in mouth pressure. But the case, outward K, is tongue. Tongue and mouth pressure, no breathing involved on the second one. There is on the first one if you want it to be a really sharp, punchy PF snare. But going from to, I think, is good practice. How practical is it doing that in a song? Depends on what effect you're going for. But being able to jump quickly from one position to another is pretty useful in general when it comes to learning all the different beatbox sounds and trying to efficiently move between some that may not be done from the same mouth position. Good counterpoint, if we were doing a PF snare to BGM, so a to a, those two are done with the same mouth position, they're just done differently. PF snare uses a P plus F and teeth essentially to make the BGM is all lip pressure to make the. So if we went that is more natural because you don't have to change mouth positions. You're basically creating the PF sound and then using a burst of air to clamp down again, and you don't readjust your mouth position. If we were to go from BGM to outward K, those are two dramatically different types of snares, and that would be something like. And do you, in all likelihood, use a pattern that jumps between those two? Maybe, maybe not. I think you can do some interesting things with alternating the bars to switch the snares out. But in the event you needed to go from one to the other, then it's going to feel a lot more natural if you've practiced sort of resetting, jumping from mouth position A to mouth position B. And then if we were to go complete opposite ends of the snare technique spectrum, they would say BGM to inward K. Two very, very different snares that sound very different. BGM or spit snare, inwards K, more breathy, requires breathing in, and has a real set mouth position with the tongue compared to the outwards K, which is just mouth pressure essentially. Going from to is a little bit unusual because, again, you have to totally reset your mouth position. But if we take the same example with the BGM to inward K, what does that sound like, or what does that feel like? I didn't practice this beforehand. I'm kind of coming up with all these examples on the fly. But in that same rhythm, we would have. And in just learning the sounds at, kind of a beginner level, if you can get comfortable jumping between those two positions once you know how to make each specific snare, and it becomes really natural and second nature to jump from that mouth position, it will vastly help later on when you start getting into more complicated rhythm compositions and how you're putting the sounds together. And I think that's useful at any level. I would probably maybe structure some of my drills for jumping between snares, maybe not necessarily in a song progression, but just to practice. Okay, I'm going to go from 1, 2, 3, and 4 different snares and do them all in a row on time, on beat, so that I can get used to doing each one in a row. So if it was like a 4 count, it might be So how would you structure that into a rhythm? Maybe something like that. That would probably require me writing it down or writing the notation out and then practicing the pattern. But you could absolutely structure a drill that's going to alternate between all four snares as a way to practice jumping from all four snares. Let me see if I can kind of come up with it on the fly and loop it a couple times. I'm trying to think of the bass rhythm. I think I have to write it out. That's very irregular. I've never practiced that way before, but maybe I will come up with a good practicable pattern, and the next time we talk about basics, I can do it well enough to demonstrate for the stream, because that's actually really hard. I have to think very, very carefully about how I'm going to go between each snare and then know which one I want, not just a random order. I'd want like PF snare first, K, outward K second, BGM, and then inward K last, so that each one is not in the same position as the one before it, while keeping it in a coherent rhythm so it doesn't sound like someone just making random noises. I'm going to take that back as a homework assignment for some point in the future, because I think that's a challenging, kind of more intermediate to advanced type of drill, but for building muscle memory and jumping between the different sounds and the way the sounds are generated, I think that would be pretty helpful. So that'll be something to revisit in the future. We'll call it like a 4-snare drill. Do I think that's very practical for using in song creation? Probably not. I don't think you'd want that many sounds kind of crammed together in a rhythm section, but you could probably find a way to make that into a cohesive rhythm that's going to kind of supplement everything else that goes into a song. I can't see why you couldn't. It would just be very complicated to do, and getting it to sound organized and clean instead of just a bunch of a mishmash of random sounds would be the challenge there. So we'll see. I'll come up with something. Before we move on from the technique sound theory discussion, I did want to touch briefly on the non-percussion based sounds and what I see as useful ways to drill or practice. And it depends on the sound, obviously, but if we take something like a bass, a real kind of simple example as far as creating the sound and then figuring out what you're going to do with it. Let's use throat bass, which is probably the easiest example for me to demonstrate. But drilling for throat bass, I think most people, when they learn how to get the sound to come out, one of the core vocalized basses, and usually one of the first ones people learn in the beginning. I think just doing the sound back to back like that with maybe a little bit of mouth distortion to change how it sounds is the first step. But practicing for sustained note creation, I've heard other beatboxers talk about this and they instruct their students, so it's not something I came up with. But practicing on sustained generation of the bass sounds, not necessarily changing notes or changing a melody, just doing the sound as long and consistently as possible is, again, something I didn't really practice in the beginning, and I kind of wish I did. So if we take something like the throat bass, undistorted, unfiltered, just a wah, and the drill being doing that as long as possible, and then seeing how long it takes before your throat or your air supply kind of gives out and you have to stop. One, helps train breath control, air management, but also just having consistency with maintaining the pitch. Like you could do things like jump up a note, jump down a note, but I think being able to just do the sound flat as consistently as possible, flat. For me, I don't do open mouth throat bass that much. It's not my preferred way to make that sound. So I do like closed lip filtered throat bass, which sounds like people who've hung around my streams before and have heard me do like the drop a beat redeem. That's usually what I put in. I've been trying to not default as much and as heavily to that type of bass sound, but it's the one I immediately go to, especially if I'm going into a beat completely cold and I haven't warmed up. In order to get my vocal cords ready in case I'm going to be doing more sounds, I will usually fit the filtered throat bass into part of whatever I'm doing, if it's a drop a beat. That way, it's part of the quote unquote song, but it's also getting vocal cords warmed up to be able to do the sound more. And I think doing sustained training would make it so that I don't have to warm up as much, which is why I'd like to work that into my overall drills and practice routines. So if we think about it from the same example I just used at the beginning, closed, lip, filtered throat bass, which is, again, that's my favorite way to do the sound. For as long as possible, you get something like and the idea would be to go until you run out of a standard breath and then keep practicing that over and over. I don't know how clear it comes across on the broadcast, but when I was just doing it a second ago, I could hear a slight shift in the sound. It's almost kind of just like a little flip with the sound, and then it goes back to the same pitch. It didn't really change. It just sounds like there's a little bit of a kind of a kick in the rhythm, or not rhythm, in the note, and then it goes back. And eliminating that is the consistency thing, which means I need to practice that more because I shouldn't be having any little fluctuations in the sound unless I want them there. So if we think about no little fluctuations there, but if I'm not careful, then I think it's probably either relaxing the vocal cords too much or tightening them out of the blue. Let's see get that to happen again, and I'll stop as soon as it happens. Maybe you change the note. I didn't hear it that time either until the very end when I just stopped. What if we went higher? I did notice a little bit of pitch warbling, a little bit of kind of dipping higher and lower than the note, but no distortion break. So that's interesting. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit and practice it more and see if that's just kind of an isolated thing because I've been talking so much, or if it's because I need to practice consistency with holding the note. Either way, doing it for as long as possible and making note of any deviations or things that affect the way the sound comes out and how that happened, I think is a good way to practice. At some point, once I get better with inward bass, I'll probably have to apply that there as well. If we take the whole concept of that sustained note and we drop down the overall sound into the lower register for vibration bass, which I've gotten a little bit complacent on practicing the lower end distorted vibration bass that we talked about several streams ago. And I need to get back into fighting shape on that because I really think there's a lot of potential for those low notes on an external vocalized bass, but I haven't been practicing it as much. I was doing it every day for a bit and then I got busy and I stopped. So if we were to take that example just to illustrate and drop down as low as possible for vibration bass, this one does have distortion on it because it's a bit more vibraty and growly. And as long as that's not like going up and down in pitch and keeping just the distortion that with that rumble, that's what we want. But this one is done so much lower in the register, the bottom of the vocal cords essentially, while not becoming like a full on like a chest bass, but it's low. So what's the sustained note for that sound like using the same filter? Let's try it. Sounds like an engine. I know. That's the point. I'm not noticing any distortion or filter breaks, but the pitch is harder to control. It's wanting to sort of pop up a little bit into my lower range instead of the very bottom. But same exercise, same rationale applies of keeping it controlled at every level you want it to be. And for that type of sound specifically, pushing as low as possible and trying to get that low rumbling growl without it becoming like a throat bass or a vocalized or chest bass or vocalized chest bass. That's the challenge. And I think I can get that sound a little bit lower, but it's difficult. That's the lowest outward sound I can make. Can I push it lower? That's about the floor. But if I keep pushing it and training that over time, I do think I can get it a little bit lower. But compared to the low range for inward bass, I think that floor is much lower by at least a couple notes. Not a whole octave, but I think at least a couple notes. But being able to get an outwards vocalized bass that low is not something I see a ton. There's some pros in the beatbox scene that have insane vibration bass. Remix is one of them. And then other people that kind of combine a vocalized chest bass to get that really low sound. Trung Bao. Actually, Trung Bao and Chihuahua do that really well. That's kind of a more long-term thing that I need to reprioritize because I was working on it for a while and I think I backslid a little bit on it. So I need to get back into practicing how to push that lower register and then keep it consistent, not just get a low note, but to keep the note as unbroken and undistorted without unintentional distortion rather. And then I could start using that in my patterns because right now my bass notes tends to kind of hover around a similar area unless I'm going high. And I would like to switch things up so that my sound isn't just stagnant, isn't just falling back on the same kind of bass notes and notation. And that will be a challenge. But I will work on that, and maybe next jam stream, whenever it'll be, sometime in June for sure. Maybe we return to basses, and it'll give me maybe a couple weeks to practice and try and refine that new lower vibration bass. That way I have something to bring back to the discussion for technique and sound theory. I think that would be a good discussion, and it would be good to show some progress between when we last talked about it and now. So I will take that back as well and see if I can come up with something and build the sound a little bit more. All right. With that, I think we will wrap up technique and sound theory discussion and go into BGM brainstorming. See if we can come up with some ideas for future projects. So let me switch my sound devices around here. I need to plug my mic back into my Scarlett. And we will get everything connected with the synth, and we will see what ideas we can come up with for BGM. So give me 1 sec to switch everything around, and then we will continue the stream. All right. I should be audible on my Scarlett now. It'll sound a bit different because I don't have all of the compression and dynamic boosts. But my synth should be audible as well. And let's change the caption. And I think everything is coming in audibly. Let me move this thing a little closer so it's easier for me to grab. Okay. I have been working on, in addition to the vocal album, I have been working on a whole bunch of tracks that are intended to be used for the Halloween project, which is, there's two major releases that are in my kind of crosshairs that I want ready and out soon. The vocal project is one, and then the Halloween project, which is a pretty large undertaking that I'm doing 100% on my own this year, just because I hate myself. I do think I have the majority of the Halloween tracks captured on the loop, but as we'll talk about when that project comes out in the fall, I am trying a different technique when it comes to recording and arranging my tracks. I'm still 100% using my loop station and my synthesizer. None of those tools have changed, no other outside sources or anything like that. But what I'm doing is going to result in more complex tracks. And the first one I've more or less finished, I think, sounds similar to what we've done in previous years. So it's not suddenly going to be a massive departure in the style or kind of the composition themes, but the amount of instruments and layers that I can include, I think is going to make it a lot more dynamic and interesting, but it's a bit harder because I have to do a lot more manual editing and manual recording. I can't just turn on the loop, play everything like it was being performed, and then call it good. So I'll go into greater detail on what I changed when we launch the Halloween project in the fall, but I think it'll be really neat. So hopefully people look forward to that. That being said, I want to mess around with some different types of themes and like song moods or tones. No real objectives here because I can always use these for different releases. So the first one, let's try and establish maybe a more mellow rhythm and then build a track around it and see where that takes us. So it's going to be a bit more freeform today. Let's see. What kind of tempo do we want to start? Maybe mid-tempo-ish. Let's kind of start with that. It's muted. I think I'm cutting it off a little too early. Oh, we could stagger it. That might make it easier to loop. There we go. I'm going to keep the playback about here. If people have trouble hearing me, then just let me know and I can lower the playback a bit. Add some hats. layer in another snare. Maybe add a bit of delay to it. Slight delay. A little bit of an echoey delay on there. Okay, that's pretty functional to start. Now we go bass line. Let's go 329, maybe distort it a bit. We could filter it. Ooh. It sounds a bit kind of more mechanical, almost synth wavy, which means if we added a single note slicer, we could be veering into synthwave territory. I was just at a synthwave concert a couple days ago, so that might be fresh in my mind. It's eighth notes. Volume's coming a little lower because the filter's kind of drowning it a bit. We could back the filter off a little. That's a little bit louder. Okay. Now, what note progression do we want? A little too high. That's a little bit different than the note progressions I normally use. Let's see if we can do that. That's a note, I think. There we go back down. Okay. Start on tempo. It's kind of like a underground dungeon theme now. Okay, let's layer in a lower octave with the unfiltered 329. Ooh. Looks like it was a little bit quiet on the first half. Okay, let's see if we can fix that. I think it's still too low. Better. Okay, so now let's move on to a melody synth. This is a different one. That one's got a little bit of a kind of synth wavy texture to it. Do one note, dual chord. Well, that's not bad. We can maybe panning delay that. Kind of makes it sound muddy though. Let's see, what if we added slicer at 16? Let's try that. We could do 16 and pan that. Let's try that. Okay, this gets us 4 tracks so far. That's not bad. The strings are lost in the background, or technically it's a vocal chorus synth. Okay, let's save this. This has got potential. Now let's think of how this would be structured if it was being performed. This sounds like a really good villain theme. Having like a filter effect as an intro would be an interesting switch up in formula. I've done it on a few tracks, but maybe having, let's try that. Maybe having the bass on its own, kind of like it's murkier submerged as a way to kind of throw off the listener. And then when the filter effect comes off, then it's the bass plus the rhythm. So what would that sound like? Let's try it. Do one more repeat. Now think of how we would structure the outro. I think for this one, and I may have to make a mental note because I don't know when I'm going to record this one, but I think having these 3 tracks be kind of like the outro instead of having it fade out to one like I do on a lot of these. That would be a more unique way to end a track. Okay. That one came together pretty quickly. If I ever do another project that I'm toying around conceptually, we'll see if I end up doing it. I would like to do another kind of more up-tempo electronic album, something in a similar vein to like Titanium Forest. I would like to take the concepts of the tracks that went into 329 and build it into more of kind of like a story, a fully fleshed out release and story with characters and art and stuff, but that would be beyond Halloween. But a song like this, the main, through line for that one would be the tracks are all heavily featuring Synth 329. It'd be kind of like 329 the album instead of just an EP, but with more kind of complexity and characters and stuff. It's something I want to do, but I gotta get to Halloween first. So we'll see. But yeah, that one will definitely be something I can use in the future. Let us jump onto a new track and come up with another idea. The synthesizer has like a whammy bar equivalent. I've never used it on any of my recordings. Yep, that's a swing song from the 90s. Hopefully just that tom line doesn't get me in trouble. Let's see if we can come up with something kind of more chill, because I do need to come up with a chill track collection too. That's not bossa nova. That might not be bad. I think I'm cutting off the start. There we go. We'll drop that down a little bit, tambourine. Cowbell. Okay, it's a good starting rhythm. It's a little bit more medium tempo for a chill track, but bass line. Now that's Chardonnay. For the bass line, let's see if we can find another instrument that we don't normally use that'll give us a different feel. Well, that's just stressful. That's a little bit different. I think that's the one I want. Maybe not screw the rhythm up. I think I did the second part too loud. The rhythm was off though. Oh man. Better. Let's add an effect on that. Ooh. This is an instrument style we used on Neon Night Lounge. Yeah. That was not Haze Mirage. It was one of the tracks on there. We used that exact same note progression, that same instrument, so we don't want to do that. Oh, that's not bad. Ooh, I like the idea of a horn counter melody. It fades out a little too much at the end, though. Go a little louder. Ooh, too late. Oh, I think it's because the horn naturally fades after a bit. Okay, that'll work. Coming in like a half second too late though, half beat. I think it is. Okay, let's fix that. Trying to think of a good progression for these chords. Weird noise coming from outside my building. That might work. You can have that start at the beginning. Not bad, not bad. All right, let's save our progress here. I don't think I'd put a filter transition on this one. I've done that a lot on especially a lot of these chill tracks. Ooh, that's a lo-fi filter. That sounds weird. That would be ring modulator. I don't know if I'd ever be able to make that type of distortion work in a song. Ending with the bass line might not be a bad idea. All right, not bad. That'll definitely be functional for 8-show release. Even reverse, the rhythm still kind of sticks to the bass line decently. think I'd have to fade in the trumpet. It comes in kind of loud. So I think I'd have to fade it in so that it's not just an abrupt bam right in your ears. Okay, let's do one more and then I'll probably take us up to the end of the stream. I have an idea and I'm going to see how easily it comes together. I want to try and do a synthwave inspired song. I don't think we haven't really done one on any of the releases since probably Linear Cannons is the closest to a synthwave song I think I've done. So we're going to set up a 4/4 kick line first. Nope. Let's go on beat. Ooh, we can use this as the snare. Maybe a little bit of delay. Now we need a sliced bass line that's going to have that kind of synth bassy sound. Yep. Ooh, synth bass might be a little bit closer. Now we got to boost it. But not have too much bass that it gets muddy. Try to put a complementary line under the bass. That's not bad. This is the single sustained note. Okay, we need a complementary high synth now. Pan this. That's fun. There's a note in the middle. It's too soft. High pass filter puts an interesting effect on the whole thing. That's definitely something we could use. All right, let's save our progress and we'll take that one from the top as far as a way to structure how it'd be performed. I think it's synthwavy-ish, like synthwave adjacent maybe. I think for this one, starting with the beat and the bass line makes the most sense. And then maybe we bring in the strings. And then that high, kind of skipping around, high melody at the end. That's the last thing to be pulled into the track. Do I want to have a filter or transition? I'll have to think about it. But let's give it a try from the beginning. Let's see what it sounds like. Oh, there's also the complementary bass line too. We bring that in next. Let's try it with the filter. All right. I think that one's got potential. I don't know what I'm going to use it for, but maybe if I ever do like a more synthwave focused collection down the road, we can take that one as a bit of a blueprint to come up with some other ones. It's definitely not like a true synthwave song, but it's very synthwave inspired, as it were, which works. That's 3 tracks. That's more productive than we've been in previous streams. The ideas kind of gelled nicely here, which is good. It's always nice when that happens. I think we will call the stream there. I do have to start getting ready for the work week. Let me take a look and see who's online that we can raid before we get ready to wrap up for today. I see Micro's online. She's playing Limbus Company again. Okay, it's been a while. We haven't raided Micro in a bit. Let's go say what's up. So what we'll do is we will mute the loop and go to outro. And we will call that a stream for today. I don't know if I'm going to be able to set a schedule for next week as far as streams go. I will think about it. And if we're going to do streams on demand like we did this week, I will post about it in the community Discord and probably on Twitter and Blue Sky. If I do set a schedule, it's only going to probably be weekend days, but I will think about it. Work's been kind of crazy lately, which is why my stream schedule has been so irregular, but I will figure that out and let everybody know when I'll be online. We'll cue this up before I forget. But in the meantime, thanks to everybody who came by and hung out. Hopefully the discussion was interesting, as well as the BGM creation. Hope everybody has a good rest of your morning, day, or evening. And I will catch you in the next stream at some point in the near future. Now let's go see how the Limbus Company is going on at MicroStream. Catch you folks later.